Boa tarde a todas e todos, sejam muito bem-vindos à Universidade do Vale do Itajaí, ao nosso programa de pós-graduação em Ciência e Jurídica. Hoje nós estamos realizando um evento que é patrocinado pelo Fundo de Apoio e Inovação à Pesquisa no Estado de Santa Catarina, FAPESC, e que é integrado com o nosso projeto de pesquisa internacional conjunto com a Delaware Law School, dos Estados Unidos, a UNIVALI, e o nosso programa de pós-graduação, que também atua diretamente ligado aos cursos de graduação da nossa universidade, por meio da parceria com a Delaware Law School, para os cursos de graduação e pós-graduação, por meio da dupla titulação. Queremos agradecer a presença de todos e aproveitamos a oportunidade para pedir que todos coloquem seus celulares no silencioso ou no modo avião, para que não surjam possíveis interrupções. O nosso evento hoje é denominado Diálogos Contemporâneos, Perspectivas Globais Sobre Direito Ambiental e Família, como também a dignidade humana inserida nesse contexto. Nós estamos recebendo duas professoras da Widener University, da Law School de Delaware, professora Erin Daly e professora Alicia Kelly, que vão falar sobre dois temas que estão interligados e conexos aos projetos de pesquisa desenvolvidos tanto pela nossa pós-graduação quanto pela graduação dos cursos de Direito e Ciência Jurídica da nossa escola em Ciências Jurídicas e Sociais. Gostaríamos primeiramente de apresentar a professora Erin Daly e agradecer sua presença e participação. Thank you. A professora Erin Daly é professora de Direito na Delaware Law School, diretora da Dignity Rights Clinic, que é a primeira clínica jurídica do mundo, dedicada a promover os direitos da dignidade da pessoa humana, e é co-diretora também da Dignity Rights Institute, onde ela atua como reitora interina e vice-reitora da Faculdade de Direito, e atuou também nesse período de 2013 a 2015 como vice-reitora desta mesma faculdade. A professora Daly escreveu sobre direito e dignidade humana, sobre direito constitucional comparado e sobre questões relacionadas à justiça transicional em todo o mundo. É autora da obra Dignity Rights, Constitutions and Courts, The World of the Human Person. E ela vai falar conosco hoje sobre Human Dignity and Human Dignity in the Courts. Gostaríamos também de aproveitar a oportunidade de apresentar a professora Alicia Kelly, que é vice-reitora de Assuntos Acadêmicos e professora do curso de Direito da Delaware Law School, nos Estados Unidos. Ela é especialista em Direito de Família, Direito de Propriedade, Direito dos Idosos, e a sua pesquisa ela é voltada para as relações familiares, comportamentos econômicos e desigualdade de gênero. A professora Alicia Kelly hoje vai falar sobre Gender Equality in the Workplace for Families. Nós vamos passar a palavra à professora Erin Daly, primeiramente, depois a professora Alicia Kelly, para que façam suas considerações. E, ao final, com o auxílio da professora Camila Monteiro, que está aqui, nos ajudando nessa parceria e trabalho transnacional, né, professora? Vamos abrir para perguntas e debates. Antes de darmos início, é importante nós registrarmos aqui algumas presenças. Gostaríamos de registrar a presença do desembargador Marcos Probst, que neste ato está representando a Academia Judicial do Estado de Santa Catarina. Gostaríamos também de registrar a presença da professora Luciane Daly, que está à frente, juntamente com outros professores do programa de pós-graduação, do projeto que integra a parceria com a Delaware Law School e o programa de pós-graduação da UNIVALI. E gostaríamos também de registrar a presença do professor Oswaldo Agripino de Castro Júnior, que nesse ato está representando o coordenador de mestrado e doutorado em Ciência Jurídica, professor Paulo Cruz, que por motivo de saúde não pôde comparecer. Registramos ainda a presença do doutor Márcio Staff, que também atua nos nossos cursos de mestrado e doutorado em Ciência Jurídica, E também não podemos deixar de agradecer a presença dos nossos bolsistas, tanto do doutorado quanto do mestrado, da equipe técnica e dos nossos alunos, que, quero crer, a grande maioria já está inscrito ou em vias de se inscrever para a dupla titulação. Sejam todos e todas muito bem-vindos. Passo, então, a palavra à professora Erin Daly para falar sobre dignidade e direitos humanos.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here. As you've heard, this is a return visit for me. I've had the honor to be in Florianopolis and several times already, and it's always a treat to come back and to make new friends and to see old friends. And at this point, we've had so many students from UNIVALI come to Delaware several times on several different occasions, that it's a real pleasure for us to be able to see our friends in Delaware when they're there studying, and then to come here and see you all again. So thank you very much for the kind invitation. As you heard, my principal area of research is in the area of dignity rights. And I want to ask a question, not just because of the language barrier, but just to understand your thinking about the idea of human dignity. So I want to ask, first of all, if you can just raise your hand if you know what the term means. Are you familiar with the idea of dignity? Raise your hand if you think you have dignity. Raise your hand if you think you have equal dignity, equal to, well, everybody else in the room and everybody else in the world. I didn't see every hand go up. All right. Can someone, you didn't know you were going to be called on, but I'm a teacher, so that's the United States. The way we teach our classes may be a little bit different here, but in the United States, teachers often teach by asking questions. So I'm in my teacher role right now. I'm asking a question. So can anybody tell me what dignity is? And you can say it in Portuguese because Camilla has kindly agreed to translate. So I asked you if you knew what it meant and if you have it. So I think everybody knows what it means. So this should be an easy question.
The opportunity to live their life. It's full.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody have anything they want to add or another way of thinking about dignity? When I first asked you what it was and if you have dignity, does anybody have a different idea? And again, thank you for the English. Very impressive, much better. But you're welcome to answer. Hello.
I think the conception of something that we priceless. Say between price and say same thing.
Yeah, very, very interesting. Anyone else want to add that? I think it's, yeah, So I think it's so interesting to hear your two answers. Your answer, your first answer before you got the microphone was you elaborated on the idea. It's the ability, the opportunity to live. And then you described sort of what that meant, to live not in poverty, to have adequate shelter, to have the things you need to live with dignity, to live a sort of a comfortable life. And you gave an answer that was in some ways very practical, right? Like what does it mean to live with dignity, to be a person who enjoys living with dignity? And your answer was in the abstract arena, right? Starting with the idea of Kant, who talks about that people should be treated not as an object for somebody else's purposes, but as a value in and of themselves. And you talked about not having a price, but sort of having an intrinsic value. And I appreciate those answers because they're so different, and yet they both go to the core of what we're talking about when we're talking about dignity, rights, and just the idea of human dignity. So I just want to mention, and I'm sure others of you have different ideas of how you would articulate what it means to have dignity or what it means to live with dignity. And of course, everybody's definition is right because that's what you believe and what you think is important. And the point I want to make, and I'll just say it directly now, and then I'll elaborate a little bit on it, is that right now we are living in a moment where courts around the world, in every region of the world, in the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, and Asia, all over the world, every country that has a court that has constitutional authority, courts are using the idea of dignity to advance human rights in a whole range of ways. So we're living in a moment where we are seeing an absolute explosion of dignity cases. And what's interesting is that they come from all over the world. And there are cases from Pakistan, for instance, where the court says dignity is very important. It's an essential part of the Muslim tradition. And right next door in India, cases that say dignity is very important. It's an essential part of our Hindu tradition. And cases from Israel that say it's an essential part of the Jewish tradition, and cases from other countries that talk about it as a Catholic or a Christian idea, and cases from many other countries that talk about it as a secular idea. Everybody sort of owns the idea of dignity for themselves. And these cases arise in an astonishing range of factual situations. So there are cases about identity, gender identity, self-expression, how we wear our hair, what jewelry we wear, what we put on our heads, what clothing we have, the kinds of personal relationships we have. The cases around the world from about 10, 15 years ago on same-sex relations were largely dignity cases. They weren't equality cases, they weren't privacy cases, they were dignity cases. We have cases, a lot of cases about the issues that you mentioned, the dignity right to health care, the dignity right to housing, the dignity right to education, the dignity right to participate in community, to live at a certain level of income so that you can live with dignity and participate in community with others. There are an increasing number of cases about dignity and environmental justice, climate justice, water justice, cases about dignity and food, nutrition, access to water for drinking, and cases about dignity relating to civil and political rights, freedom of speech and conscience, freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom to vote and to participate in political action. all of these cases are described by the courts as cases relating to human dignity. And when the courts are protecting these rights, they're saying we protect these rights because it is essential to human dignity. And one of the things, we see a number of different attributes of these cases. So they're coming up all over the world in all different legal traditions, in countries that are very, very different: civil law countries, common law countries, religious law countries, hybrid countries, and about all these different things. And yet judges everywhere are saying, to really understand why this particular right is important, we have to understand it as a matter of human dignity. You don't just have the right to free speech. You have the right to freedom of speech because it's a matter of dignity. You have the right to a decent standard of living because it's a matter of human dignity. You have a right to be treated a certain way by police or by people if you're in a prison, or by people in other positions of authority, not just because it's a good thing to do or the right thing to do, but because it's essential as a matter of human dignity. And the cases about dignity have certain attributes, certain qualities, not necessarily every single one having every single attribute, but we see themes in what the courts are doing when they're referring to dignity. One is that they're describing dignity as a value, sometimes a fundamental value of the society or of the constitutional system. When a judge doesn't know whether to rule this way or that way, they may rule in favor of the dignity claim because of the importance of dignity. But we also see it as an actionable right. Increasingly, people can go into court and simply assert the right to dignity, sometimes with a right to equality or privacy or something else, and sometimes just as the right to dignity. So it's what we call in the United States a justiciable right, an actionable right that a court can recognize. Often these courts are recognizing dignity not as a normal right, but as a right that is unique or at least unusual in being non-derogable. The first article of the German Basic Law says that human dignity is inviolable, and other constitutions have that language as well. And even where the constitutions don't say it, many courts say that the right to dignity is inviolable. There is no justification for violating a person's dignity. Once the court says this is a dignity right, they don't ask the government, well, why did you do that? Why did you commit torture? Why did you treat that prisoner that way? Why did you prevent that abortion? Whatever the issue is. If it's a dignity right, there is no justification for violating it. And that makes it different than many other rights that are balanced, or where we sometimes say, well, in narrow circumstances, the government can violate the right in a case of emergency or something like that. Dignity rights cannot be violated precisely because what they protect is what's most essential to the human person. They're also often dignity rights are transformative, and courts are referring to dignity in order to change the way the law is thought about, in order to change the line between the individual and the state. So, for instance, in the same-sex marriage cases, and there are cases about this in many different countries around the world, recognizing the right to same-sex marriage. This was a right that wasn't recognized 20 years ago. And in the course of about 10 or 15 years, it became a global right. And there were cases in Canada and South Africa, even in the United States, in countries in Latin America, and many countries, and in Europe, that said, this is who you choose to marry is a matter of your own human dignity. And the work that dignity is doing in these cases is to allow the court to say, even though for decades or even centuries, the law was one way, it recognized marriage in a certain way as a certain type of relationship. But once we recognize that who you marry is so important to the core of who you are, then the court says we have to respect the dignity of each person's choice. And that forces a change in the law. And we see this in a number of different areas where the notion of dignity is doing this transformative work. It's like the engine that is moving the society from one set of values, maybe more traditional values, often more patriarchal values, and moving it to a different set of values where every human being is valued. The last point I'll make about the dignity cases is that for some judges, and this is particularly true in the United States, we do not recognize dignity explicitly in our Constitution. I heard her mention my Dignity Rights Clinic, and we're working there with students, including some of our foreign students, to encourage courts, invite judges to think more seriously about the role of dignity in American constitutional law. It's a challenge because many judges are concerned about separation of powers, and rightfully so, right? They don't want to overstep their bounds. They don't want to be deciding cases where there really is no law. And so they're nervous about recognizing this very broad and amorphous concept, this concept that each of us in this room might have a different definition for. Judges are often nervous about accepting that dignity is a part of the law. But it's my view that when judges do accept that dignity is a very critical part of the law, in fact, it's really the purpose of law. The purpose of law, the reason why we come together in society and create law and choose to have a system that operates under the rule of law rather than under raw power or violence or some other alternative that doesn't seem as good. The reason we choose law as a way to live is because it's the best mechanism we have for respecting human dignity and for protecting each person's inherent worth. So the judges that are incorporating this idea into their jurisprudence are enhancing the capacity of each person in the society, including the people I think that you might have been thinking about, people who are poor, people who are marginalized, people who don't typically have a voice in politics, people who sometimes aren't listened to or are not seen. Dignity jurisprudence sees those people as equal members of society and recognizes that each one of those people counts equally in a society. And in that way, those judges who are choosing to engage on dignity in this way are actually not only strengthening and empowering each person, right, to be aware of their own dignity, to express their own dignity in society with others, but they're also strengthening democracy by making sure that every person lives within a jurisdiction. Every person in the community has a voice and has an equal voice, and that voice and that vote counts. So I would invite you to just think about the work that dignity is doing. As Brazilians, you're very likely to see it in far more cases than we see it in American cases. But when you notice it in a case, pay attention to the work that it's doing and to why the court thinks it's important to say this isn't just a matter of privacy or equality or something else, but a matter of human dignity. So thank you very much, and I look forward to any conversation afterward. Yep.
Ainda gostaríamos de passar a palavra à doutora Alicia Kelly, e agradecendo mais uma vez sua participação. A professora Alicia vai tratar da questão de desigualdade de gênero, né? Gender Equality in the Workplace for Family. Com a palavra, professora Alicia.
Thank you so much. Obrigada. Desculpem, no falo português. Very honored to be here. It's a privilege. It's so wonderful to be with our university partners, friends. Had a wonderful week here as visiting professors, speaking to judges. Delighted to spend time with students and faculty directly here at the university. I invite you at any point today to talk to us about the partnership we have and opportunities for exchanging ideas. We've also worked collectively with faculty members, writing papers together, and it's been a fantastic part. Thank you so much to our friends who are making us so beautiful the entire week. So I'm going to talk about sex inequality in the United States and some of the laws that govern sex inequality. And it follows from some of what my wonderful colleague Erin Daly has been talking about. And you could conceptualize what I'm going to talk about, gender equality, as like one piece of what a human dignity right umbrella would fit into, right? So they definitely connect with each other. And how many people in this room are part of a family? Everybody, right? How many people in this room will work in their lives at a job? Everybody, right? So this is the law of everyday life, how families can figure out how to be working and also supporting family members in a way that creates a productive workforce and a strong economy, and also allows people to do the caregiving work that families need for older people, for younger people, for each other. And in the United States, and I don't know enough about Brazil to know, and I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are. There's an infrastructure, a system that really does not accommodate families who are going to work, which is so many people in the world. So in the US, there is a very strong expectation that someone who's employed in the workplace is going to work an enormous amount of hours, at least 40 hours a week, absolutely. And many jobs, especially the higher paying jobs, the higher status jobs, 50 to 60 hours a week is often typical. And the workplace ideals also assume that you're not going to take time off, that you're not going to get sick, that you're not going to get pregnant, that you're not going to be a parent, that you're not going to have a parent older and who is dependent on you that needs to be taken care of. Have this very work-centric cultural norms and expectations in the workplace that just directly conflict with the way everyday people live their lives. And I know from a talk we gave yesterday with Brazilian judges that there's similar conflict and difficulty combining work and family in Brazil, and as true as, of course, much of the world. So the bad news is that we still have pervasive sex discrimination in the US and across the globe, and that comes out in a whole bunch of different ways in the workplace. So first, we have just gender discrimination, inequality in the way people are conceiving of women in the workplace. So we have sexual harassment. Women have lower wages in the US for doing the same job. We actually have a law called the Equal Pay Act that requires if someone is doing the same job, that it's really a comparable job, that there must be the same pay. And that's because of a history of that not occurring. Lower wages for the same job. We have a very sex segregated workplace. So some jobs are for women, like being a secretary. 97% of the secretaries in the US are women. 97% of the mechanics are men. So we have sex segregated workplaces, and it tends to then fall into that the work that women are doing is paid less and valued less, and the work that men are doing higher paid, higher value. And there's just sex discrimination in the workplace, but especially around and as families, family members of a family, and as wives, women as mothers. So there's the most common form of sex discrimination in the workplace is actually pregnancy discrimination. Discrimination against people who are pregnant, women who are pregnant, and that includes people not getting hired because you might become pregnant one day, people who are getting fired, literally fired because they are pregnant. And this is a recurring and common problem in the US and in many places. And then there's a particular problem for caregivers in the workplace, and that, of course, includes men more and more than it has historically, but it's still the case that women do twice the amount of childcare than men, and that also includes, a very important development in caregiving. People are living longer than ever before. They also have prolonged periods of disability or dependency in older age, and women are disproportionately doing that work as well, including take care of their partners or their husbands' parents, right? So caregiving is still historically women's work. And there's a lot of reasons I write in my research about this. So I'm not criticizing the way people are organizing their lives. There's a reason why they're making the choices they are. So much of our gender identity is tied up into cultural norms that we have that make us who we are, So I'm a mother. I have a strong identity about myself as a mother, and that's a wonderful thing for me to have. But what happens when people are making choices about how they're going to work and how they're going to take care of families is tend to follow a gender pattern that's easy, right? So if you already have a strong identity as being a mother and there has to be a choice about who's going to work full-time, if somebody might work part-time to take care of children, it's just a natural flow of gender norms for the family collectively to decide it's going to be the mother who's going to diminish her attachment to the workforce, and it's going to be the father who is going to, maximize his. There's also something in the literature called the motherhood penalty. So workers who are mothers have decreased wages. It's a very bad career decision to have a child, right? There's all these norms that happen just for women in the workplace generally, but also especially for mothers. An assumption that mothers are going to be much more committed to family than they are to work, right? These are stereotypes and biases. That fathers are not going to be committed to caregiving primarily. They're going to be committed to being in the workforce and being the breadwinner for the family and supporting the family that way, rather than it being a caregiver for children. And so these patterns play out in a way that really is undermines women's economic resources, right? Including retirement, including earning power, including promotions over time. So there's a very big impact for women's economic resources, but otherwise too, for having autonomy and having her own identity in the workplace as a worker in addition to perhaps a caregiver. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in U.S. law, but I first wanted to say in the U.S. women earn 82 cents on the dollar compared to men, and that's comparing men who are working full-time to women who are working full-time, which doesn't get to the phenomenon that we have in the US, that mothers of children under 18, about a third of mothers in the US are working full-time. So 2/3 are not. Another 1/3 are working part-time, and then another 1/3 are working, take a break, a significant break from working during the time where they're having children, especially young children. So that wage gap that you hear about is for full-time working women compared to full-time working men, which leaves out 2/3 of the women in the US. So the wage gap is much more, and that motherhood penalty is very significant of the finances of women Sex discrimination is very common. This is a very recent study. 42% of working women experience discrimination on the job. 42% of women experience discrimination on the job. I just want to pick up a little bit more on the importance of women being in the workplace. Protecting that connection to the market is so important for women, for themselves, for their own financial power, but also for children who they support, and also for the families that they support, and also for the economy of the country, right, and the region where they are. And then, of course, for having diverse perspectives and skills and adding, a rich breadth of ideas and perspectives and experiences in the workplace, which makes work better, the work environment better, and also can help protect women's and men's dignity. We have a couple of major laws in the US that try to address some of these issues. There's a new law since 2023 called the Pregnancy Discrimination Fairness Act. And so just a year ago, not even a year ago, first time in the US, we have a rule that says when you are pregnant in the workplace, there have to be accommodations there have to be accommodations for you. If the physical condition of your pregnancy requires that you have an adjustment to the type of work that you're doing. Perhaps you can no longer be expected to pick up more than 15 pounds if your job requires heavy lifting. Perhaps you have an opportunity to sit down on your job more often than you otherwise would if you have a job that requires standing, that kind of thing. But also includes an ability to take time away to have a child, take time away from the workday. For example, if you're a nursing mother, that you have an opportunity to actually have lactation breaks if you are choosing that. And these accommodations are now an entitlement that you have if you qualify and you need an accommodation, and the federal government is the enforcer of. So you can go to an administrative agency and say, I'm having a problem, there's not compliance with responsibilities that my employer has to provide accommodation. So there's an enforcement mechanism that's very important because the problem is so common. For that, the only way you could get an accommodation for pregnancy is by using the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you had to demonstrate that you were disabled as a result of your pregnancy. Just think about that for a minute. Like, it's very common, right? One of the judges yesterday said everyone in this room came to the world from a pregnant woman, right? Like this is ordinary everyday life, right? So to have the workplace, previously you had to just work so hard and engineer a solution to a problem that you have, even though the problem you have is incredibly common, half the population. There is recently a law that I'm really excited about in the US, but it's only a number of states. So I was just talking about the Pregnancy Fairness Act is a federal law, so it applies all across the country to every state in the US. But there's also state law in the US, and there's a number of states that are saying there's a new type of employment discrimination law called family responsibilities discrimination. And so instead of discrimination based on sex, which can include family responsibilities discrimination, if you tie family responsibility to motherhood, right, you make it gendered. But there is an opportunity now in these states that have, or cities that have this rule, that you can argue that your employer is violating your right, or you have a right not to be discriminated against based on your being a person who's a caregiver for a family member. And I can give you an example of one of these. This is quite recent. And this whole phenomenon of family responsibilities discrimination is only 10 years old. And remember, it's only a small number of places that have this. It's not a federal law. This is not. normally can't argue for family responsibility in most states. So an example, a surgical nurse took family leave intermittently, like took time off, overtime, repeatedly for a period of 2 years to care for her ailing mother. She was entitled to leave under the Family Medical Leave Act, which I'll talk just briefly about in a moment. So she was allowed to take this leave, but nonetheless, she took the leave she was legally entitled to take, but she was punished for doing that, and she was ultimately fired. And her supervisor said to her, well, how much longer can she last, as sick as she is? And when she was fired, like in the process of firing her, the employer says, you won't have to ever call in again about mama. That case was a very good case for family caregiving responsibility discrimination, and the case settled for some undisclosed amount. I'm also familiar with another case. So men have sometimes been able to make this argument successfully because it's about caregivers. And there was a janitor in a hospital actually taking care of both of his parents who died within 6 months of each other. One had Alzheimer's for a very long period of time. The other person had, I think it was cancer. Was taking care of his parents, as needed. And with some other complexities I won't share with you, he got fired ultimately for doing this. And he got, had the right to take the leave as well, but still was fired. Perception, especially that men are not caregivers and it's inappropriate for them to be leaving the workplace, or at least that's a cultural and social norm that we still have. That case settled, the one I was talking about, the janitor, for $4 million. So this is a big incentive for business owners to make decisions. They have to be much more careful when they are making decisions about firing someone or not promoting them as a result of family caregiving responsibility. But in most states, you don't have the opportunity to argue for family caregiving responsibilities. You can argue for sex discrimination. There's a law called Title VII, federal law that applies across the country. And under Title VII, you can argue that you've experienced sex discrimination. And there's actually the system is organized to kind of shift the burden of proof away from the person who's arguing for discrimination to the employer at a certain point in time. And that's really important in discrimination cases because they're notoriously difficult to prove. Put the burden of proof on the claimant, the person who says they were discriminated against. They have to prove what was in the mind of the employer, right? Was it intentional discrimination? What was the basis for a decision that you make? And that's very difficult to do, especially if someone's going to defend themselves, likely will. So one of the ways you can kind of bring in family caregiving discrimination is to say that it's a form of sex discrimination. And it's very frequently the case. So if there is, I'll give you another example of one more case. A woman her job was to sell cars in a car dealership. And that's a very, very male dominated field. All the people who sell cars in the US are men. And so she was given periods of time during the week where she was assigned to work for very bad times to be selling cars. So in the US on Saturdays, that's when the car dealerships are open. So she was never assigned to a Saturday. And then her job was to bring in sales, and she was measured on her performance for bringing in sales. But then she wasn't assigned to the time where she could have very successful sales. And then she was criticized for not being very successful at her job. And part of the strategy of the employer was, he said, mothers don't belong at work. So like very explicit sex discrimination, right? Very clear evidence, mothers don't belong at work. And then he was, punishing her essentially for not complying with his stereotypes by the assignment process. So she was able to argue that the employer's reaction to her taking care of her children and his correct comments to her about a mother is a form of sex stereotyping because the same standards are not applied to men. And so you don't assume that a man doesn't belong in the workplace. And tying, motherhood as a version of sex discrimination is the way you can get to some of these cases in the many places in the US that don't have direct family responsibilities discrimination. You have to argue it's a part of sex discrimination. And there is some success with those types of claims, especially because we have that administrative agency in the US that is bringing these claims. Last thing I'll talk about, and I promise I will be quiet and be happy to hear from you, is the Family Medical Leave Act in the US. We had no federally required until 1993. This federal law was adopted, and it lets you take a leave to take care of yourself if you're sick, and it lets you take a leave to take care of children, to have children, to take care of family members, including parents, specifically defined in the statute. Very importantly, it's unpaid leave. So you can take up to 12 weeks of leave for the birth of a new child, for example, or because you have a family member who's ill and you're going to be the caregiver, but there is no compensation that comes with it. So no insurance, you must take the leave without pay. And for that reason, you can imagine that most people who are employed can't take 12 weeks off without pay unless you're really, have a lot of money to start out or have pretty good income or you have saved. So as a practical matter, it's not helping very many families because of the lack of paid leave. Now, some states have started to adopt paid leave, but not the federal government, which requires unpaid leave. And last thing I'll say about that is even the Family Medical Leave Act only applies to about 60% of the businesses in the US. It doesn't apply to small businesses. And small businesses are very important in the economy in the US. And so 40% of the businesses are not required to give you a leave, even unpaid leave in the US. So we have lots of work to do to try to help support families, be workers, and also to be members of families in our society. And unfortunately, that was the theme of yesterday. Much work to be done, and happy and delighted to talk more about it. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, professors, for the wonderful talks. These talks about human dignity and dignity in the workplace, because that's what we're actually talking about, they refer to everyone's lives. Everybody has a family, everybody was born for someone, as you mentioned, and eventually everybody will insert themselves in the workplace and maybe be subject to this kind of discrimination. So it's really important that we hear from you, especially because here in Brazil, we tend to look up to American culture as a whole. Yeah, we listen to your songs, we watch the movies and series you produce, but in this particular matter, I think we are one step ahead. So I would like to open this space for questions. You may ask them in Portuguese or in English as you feel comfortable, but it would be really interesting if we could start a debate. Okay? Anyone wants to start?
Alicia, states in the United States have laws against there might be any kind of relationship based on conservative.
A small number, I want to say 6 or 7, don't hold me to that number, but it's not just states that are doing it, it's cities. Cities have authority sometimes to do that. But it's a small number, but it definitely has been growing. And so there are legislatures in different states that are considering adopting the law. So it will be, if it becomes typical to have this, it's an incredibly important protection for families in the workplace. Places that have it tend to be progressive, liberal. Yeah.
Like it would be the other. conservativeness, really just
that not having them might be come from a particular political or religious ideology. Yeah, I don't know enough about that, but that
second question is Kelly. You said that the courthouse legislature to go ahead the border justice and the Congress House, right? My point is, here in Brazil we have a Supreme Court house sometimes needs to. It's our court. It's not some rules that we've been waiting for. Example, same-sex marriage. We haven't had any law for that years, and there are some law projects. Congress voted, just sitting on them. So we have a lot of problems with people petitioning and asking for things, and then we have our Supreme Court house legislating because our Congress doesn't do that. And we have a lot of other issues that same thing happens. Point is, sometimes isn't it better that the justice needs to, like, because of balance and balance, sometimes one of the needs to go on a little bit, so in order to force the other one to do their job.
I would say that we have the same situation in the United States. And of course, in the United States, there's lawmaking power at the federal level as well as at the state level. Is talking about, and the same situation exists at both. I think many judges in the US would answer your question by saying, maybe that is a problem, but it's not a problem for the judiciary to solve. It's a problem, it's a political problem. So if people want those laws passed, they should vote for people who are going to pass those laws. That is one response to it. I have seen, with respect to dignity cases in particular, where courts have established administrative agencies to deal with particular problems where the government hasn't been doing enough, where courts have imposed on legislatures or parliaments the obligation to pass certain kinds of legislation so that, for instance, with a pension law or something, so that people can live with dignity, to not let the level stay where it was 20 years ago, but to update it in order to ensure that people can continue to live with dignity. So dignity is also, the dignity cases are also areas where some courts have said, because of the obligation to protect dignity, that obligation is so fundamental, so important, we cannot just let the political process work or not work. We have to step in. And they found ways to do that that doesn't actually legislate. It doesn't say this is what the law should be. It just imposes upon the government the obligation to figure it out for themselves, but to act.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. I have a question for Alicia. Those cases that you mentioned, I was wondering, I'm not a law professor, but I'm a professor here at UNIVALI in the International program. And I was wondering, how do you make proof? How do you make your proof of arguments in your cases in order not to turn it into a hearsay case? Like when you said that the boss said something about the employee, and how would you prove that? How would you produce those?
yeah, so it's a matter of finding facts that you can prove in court, and the testimony of the person who's alleging discrimination is absolutely evidence that can be considered. So is testimony of the person who's accused of doing discrimination. So it's very nice to have evidence outside of or speaking, and look to see if there's emails, if there's something in writing. This woman who was the car dealership salesperson, her performance evaluations you could look at, but you could also look at what her assignments were, right? And look at her schedule for when she wasn't scheduled for Saturday. And see if other people were around who could testify that I knew that he thought mothers shouldn't be in the workplace because he said that in front of me. So hearing from other people who might have witnessed some of the misconduct and then put them on the stand.
Congratulations, professors, for their lectures. I would like to ask first Professor Daly. Our Brazilian Constitution, in the first article, includes the dignity of a human person as a fundamental right. Since that in the U.S. Constitution there is no mention about dignity. So I guess that the lack of dignity is a political problem. So what is the best public policy in U.S. concerning to provide the dignity of the person? It's in the federal level. There is some special state because the United States has 50 states. They are very different. Or there is a special county. Where is the best place to live in US if I am interested in the state or the government provide me dignity? Of the Professor Daly. And I had one other question to Professor Alicia.
Montana. Have you ever heard of the state of
No,
Montana?
Montana.
So the reason I say Montana is that every state in the United States has a constitution. As you mentioned, the U.S. federal constitution does not mention dignity. Most states' constitutions don't mention a right to dignity except to vindicate, to protect the dignity of crime victims. There's a lot of provisions in constitutions to protect the dignity of crime victims. It's part of a victims' rights movement that sort of swept through the country. And there's a few other states that have dignity sort of as a right in their constitution or mentioned in some way that's broader, that sort of reflects the values that we're talking about here. But the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, which is not a state but has a unique status, and the Constitution of Montana are the only two places in the country that have dignity as an actionable right. And there are a lot of cases in Puerto Rico and a few cases in Montana that protect the right to dignity in certain instances, particularly as a matter of equality. Beyond that, I would say sort of the broader answer to your question is just, it's hard to say, and we all probably have our own definitions of what it means to live with dignity. And so some people might, choose to live in one area or in another. There is no federal right to housing, to education, to healthcare. We don't have social rights in our constitutional system. We don't have positive rights in our constitutional system, which contributes to the problem that you were identifying. But a lot of states have a right to education or right to other kinds of things, environmental rights and things like that in their. And as you mentioned, with respect to cities, a lot of times some of the more progressive legislation starts in cities and then sort of gets absorbed at the state level and sometimes federal level.
The same question to Professor Alicia concerning points of or lack of job. Is there some federal law or public policy from the state or the federal government of a county which provides more than the other regions of the United States?
Yeah, some of the more, so there's paid family leave in Northeast and in California. So again, it tends to be the more liberal, positive rights states that have been looking at this as a matter of sex equality, in addition to supporting families, but very much about equality for women. Did I answer your question? Yes. No, I mean, having human dignity rights in the Constitution is an enormously influential thing. And as Professor Daly was saying, it can be transformative because you have to comply with this constitutional mandate that can't be changed, or right, it's inviolable. And then you can have a transformation of an issue like with sexual so many other things, the climate by a judge who's enforcing that constitutional provision to make enormous social change, right? And to just say the law has to reflect the right of dignity, even if the entire country disagrees, even if the society isn't moving in that direction, or at least not quickly. It's an amazing tool. And we don't have that in the US. And we have so much political divide, more and more so. And so it's very difficult to get people to come together, come to values that we hold dear in our country.
So, finishing this part of questions, I'd like to thank you all for interacting with our lecturers. And for us to close this afternoon activity, the professors would like to make an invitation for you, all of you, because our partnership with Widener is very broad. And of course, we're talking to UNIVALI students here, but we have a large group of exchange students who are sitting there and listening to your talk. You could afterwards tell the professors where you come from, because I've seen many different nationalities in Wilmington, which is where they are. So please do the invitations.
So thank you so much. We just wanted to tell you a little bit about the partnership that we have with UNIVALI and what opportunities we have to exchange ideas and make connections with each other and learn from each other, and also bring back the lessons that come from talking to each other and learning from each other to your career development, to your development of social ideas here, to policies, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a really rich and robust partnership. We've had it for, I think, 7 years. And Professor Daly was actually the person who helped to found the partnership and was here and met Marcelo, and I'm not sure. So it's been an amazing experience for me personally to get to learn new cultures and new people. And we love the Brazilian people. So beautiful, so connected, so warm. It's fantastic. It's incredible caregivers. So we have a lot of opportunity for you to come. And I would say one of the things that you would probably experience, the best part of the experience, or one of the best parts of coming to the United States, coming to Delaware, and meeting people from around the world who are also going to study classes together. And so it creates a community. Delaware Law School has its own campus. It's very, very safe, like bucolic. green and trees and beautiful. So there's this intellectual life that will also include the social connection with people. And then what I hear students telling me that they appreciate so much about the program is they take a degree, if you're going to come for a degree, and then they bring it back to their country of origin, and it really enhances, their perspective. They've really broadened their view of the world and many issues, but it also very much enhances their careers, right? It lets you forward in different ways than you couldn't even maybe conceptualize before. So we definitely would invite everyone who's interested to please consider coming, spending some time with us, learning with us, and being a part of this billion and United States community that we've been building together.
You. I just want to, I'll tell you a little bit about the programs that we have, but I do just want to reinforce something that that Alicia just mentioned, just to remember that the connections that you make when you're, well, in law school anywhere, but particularly when you go to another country and you meet people from that country as well as from other places around the world, those are lifelong connections, so that your friend group and the group of people that you went through law school with, as you know, you're an international student here, but that friend group is global and stays with you throughout your life. And it's just a wonderful way to sort of invest in your legal education to make sure that you maintain, that you obtain not just a global perspective in your thinking, but that you retain a global network of friends and colleagues who, like you, will be going through their career sort of in similar paths, but in different countries. We work really hard at the law school to ensure that the students who come from other countries are part of the academic and social environment of the law school. So LLM students, for instance, are in our classes. They're taking constitutional law or civil procedure law or a clinic class with other students from other countries, as well as the JD students from the United States. One of the things that makes our relationship with UNIVALI unique is that we've had students at pretty much every stage of their legal education career be involved in studies at UNIVALI and also at Delaware Law School. So people have obtained their dual MJ degree before their basic law degree. They can obtain an MJ degree, and Camilla knows much more about this, with both UNIVALI and also Widener University, Delaware Law School. At the same time, students who already have their law degree but want to pursue a master's can come get a dual degree as a master's student. We offer several kinds of master's programs. We offer one in human rights that looks at some of the issues that we've been talking about today. We also offer a dual degree master's program in corporate law. And of course, Delaware Law School is sort of at the center of the corporate legal community in the United States and throughout the world. So students who come to us from around the world to study at Delaware Law School will learn from some of the leading practitioners of US corporate law. They will go visit the Chancery Court, which is a unique court system in Delaware that is responsible really for developing American corporate law. Or they'll hear cases with the Delaware Supreme Court and meet justices and others who are involved in the world of creating and shaping Delaware corporate law. We also have a master's in American Legal Studies, and this is specifically designed for students who would like to practice law in the United States as well often as in their home country. And they'll come to us and take a year of basic legal classes, just like our JD students do, to prepare them for taking the bar exam in New York or California, so that they can then have a license to practice not only in their home country, but also in the United States. Students who want to pursue other further legal studies come to us for a dual SJD, sort of a doctorate in the law, and they can again obtain an SJD both at UNIVALI and at Delaware Law School. And we help support that research. We also offer students other opportunities to come not for a degree certificate, but just to pursue their studies, to take classes during the summer, sometimes during the semester with other students. So there's a whole range of opportunities, and we're growing these opportunities every day, really. Outside, you might have seen as you walked in, there are a number of flyers. Please feel free to take them, and they describe some of the programs and offer the contact information where you can us if you have any questions at all about it.
Okay, so I've been asked to talk about my experience. I've been to Wilmington. I stayed there, spent the month of January visiting Widener, and had the chance to know the city and spend some time. It's near New York. It's near Washington, D.C. It's a train away, and everything is connected by train rail, and it's really comfortable and cozy. And they're very warm. They welcome you. I was at the International Students Reception. It was like, I felt like part of the group, even though I wasn't. Yeah. And everything about being there made me evolve in my research. So I really recommend going there. We're going again in April. Yeah. Visiting you one more time. And yes, you too, Professor. Are you going?
Especially in Delaware, because Delaware it's a place, as a professor said, very important to the corporate law and tax relief. I took my PhD at Federal University of Santa Catarina in 1998, and I compared the Brazilian judicial system with the US judicial system, stayed 1 year at Stanford. So Delaware, for the persons, the students that want to have a career concerned to business law and human rights, also tax law, the best place, how can I say, the regulations of Delaware, it's one of the best of the world. I recommend, if you want to understand that, for example, I watched the Netflix, the film Spotify, where there is a decision of court of chancery concerned the case. So I would recommend you to study in US, especially Delaware, which is quite near from Washington, New York, and Philadelphia airport, and it's not expensive because there are trains, and the transport, public transport is very good.
Thank you, Professor. So we'd like one more time to thank you all for being here, taking the time to listening to the lectures. I hope it was caused food for thought. That's the idea. Every time we get to hear different thoughts, different perspectives, we grow a little. So I hope it contributed to you as much as it did to me. Thank you, professors, for taking the time to be here with us today. Jaque, faz o fechamento. Então é isso, está encerrada a sessão. Muito obrigada, uma boa tarde a todos e um bom retorno.